Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That is for you to decide. Anyone who's spent at least 5 seconds world building knows that one of the most alluring aspects of it is the opportunity to establish your own pantheon. Your cast of supremely powerful beings that embody or represent, well, whatever you want the building blocks of your world to be. Elements, aspects of life, aspects of the world, or physics itself. Really, whatever you may want to get a little bit of focus in your narrative. That isn't to say that pantheons are necessary. Quite the contrary, most fiction works quite well without them, and even if they are included, it's often the case that less is more. But you can't deny that coming up with them is incredibly fun. Heck, we as a society are fairly obsessed with real-life pantheons of what are pretty much now dead religions. The Greek pantheon has dominated this scene since pretty much forever, just due to it being the most well-documented and it having an official grouping of the 12 Olympians. Well, kind of 13 because poor Hestia had her spot supplanted by Dionysus, and despite definitely not being an Olympian, you kind of want to include Hades regardless, so 14? Norse and Egyptian pantheons probably take silver and bronze medals here, but there are no shortage to draw from if you want some direct inspiration for your writing project. So yeah, pantheons are fun, especially when you get to design them yourself. Perhaps too fun. It's absurdly easy to fall into the trap of having too expansive of a pantheon, or letting your pantheon dominate a story that was not originally about it. And at least in the context of this video, I think the concept of a pantheon can easily be extended to non-deities. There are plenty of stories that feature a group of ultra-powerful beings that need to be thwarted. Heck, any series that prominently features military ranks can fit here. Despite not having delved terribly far into actual deities, One Piece is absolutely rife with pantheons through its warlords, emperors, and admirals. But let's rein it back to Warcraft, and do a quick rundown of all the pantheons that can be found within its lore. And depending on how loosely we want to define pantheon, there are a lot of them. Certainly enough to represent an astounding breadth of power levels. Let's get into it though. Probably the most populated and loosely defined pantheon in WoW would be Wild Gods, or Loa as the trolls refer to them. There are a metric ton of these, and the cutoff can be hard to define. Pretty much anything that comes from nature and gets worshipped to a small degree can fall into this category, and as we see with Loa especially, the more and stronger followers they have, the stronger the Loa become in turn. It's a very symbiotic relationship, as seen with the Zandalari, though that certainly hasn't stopped certain peoples from abusing, absorbing, or enslaving their Loa. I'm going to quickly run through the wiki's list of wild gods in Loa, but not really delve into any individual ones because we don't have all day. We have Agamagan, Aecina, Ashmane, Aviana, Cenarius, Goldrin, Malorn, Omen, Tortola, Ursoc, Ursol, Lycanthoth, Nemesis, Yulan, Shuen, Chiji, Nuzao, Akali, Akaldara, Akalzone, Akunda, Bethic, Dambala, Shadra, Kimball, Gonk, Grawl, Halazi, Hakar, Harkoa, Hethys, Hyreek, Johnny, Jonalai, Craigwa, Lakali, Mamtoth, Nalarak, Paku, Quetzloon, Kaonzu, Razan, Runak, Sethralis, Shirvala, Saratus, Thoronja, Torkali, Torga, Bwansamdi, Gahun, Gramath, Kevoyasiti, Kithix, Luko, Samedi, Shango, Muzala, Zibala, Zanza, Ather, Athaine, Arostor, Durzan, Belst, Ealalothen, Lagorek, Nespira, Owakanoa, Anzu, Seth, Kaalu, Rukmar, Alioth, Renard, Falir, Leah, and Om. That's 79 if you weren't counting, as well as countless other speculative ones. I'm sure you recognized many, but I guarantee you didn't recognize them all. So while they may be important in individual storylines, the vast majority aren't really a big deal at all in the grand scheme of things. If they're important, you probably know them by name. The only 4 I'm going to really highlight here are the August Celestials of Pandaria. These 4, Nuzao the Black Ox, Shuen the White Tiger, Yulan the Jade Serpent, and Chiji the Red Crane, form their own sub-pantheon, and are quite clearly based on the 4 gods or beasts of Chinese mythology. Xuanwu, the Black Tortoise of the North, Baihu, the White Tiger of the West, Qinglong, the Azure Dragon of the East, and Juchao, the vermilion bird of the south. The dragon had its color swapped, the turtle and tiger swapped positions, and the turtle was swapped out for an ox, but it's still pretty apparent. There's also sometimes a fifth god, Huanglong, the yellow dragon of the center, but that doesn't seem to be represented in WoW whatsoever. It'd be easy to claim that wild gods are just the bottom tier deities of life, but given that we have some ties to death and the void, I'm hesitant to place the entire group there, and I'm leaving them here as sort of their own thing. Moving on to a substantially smaller and more straightforward pantheon, we have the Elemental Lords. These were the 4 dominant elementals that emerged during primordial Azeroth, often warring against each other and uniting only in an attempt to fend off the invading old gods and their empire, though to no avail. They were later imprisoned by the Titan forged within the elemental plane. We had Ragnaros the Firelord, ruler of the Firelands, Therazane the Stone Mother, ruler of Deepholm, Neptulon the Tidehunter, ruler of the Abyssal Maw, and Alakir the Windlord, ruler of Skywall. We of course fought back a summoned Ragnaros in Molten Core in Vanilla. Come Cataclysm, Ragnaros and Alakir threw their lot in with Deathwing, though we defeat both of them in their own planes, killing them for good. Probably. In contrast, we worked with Therazane and Neptulon, with Neptulon being captured by the Naga in Kata and escaping off-screen before Legion. In Legion, the Earthen Ring manages to get the Elemental Lords to unite with them in fending off the Legion, and helped appoint replacement lords, Smoldron for fire elementals, and Thunderan for air elementals, a Prince of Air whom we'd summoned and slain in Vanilla as the culmination of the Thunder Fury chain. In Dragonflight, Smoldron threw his lot in with Farak before we slay him, perhaps temporarily, and his power is absorbed into Firalath. The Elemental Lords certainly seem to carry more gravitas to them than Wild Gods, and are much better defined, but are still relatively low on the totem pole of WoW's deities. Another group that kinda fits are the 4 Incarnates, proto-dragons who underwent a dangerous ritual to infuse themselves with the power of the elements. There seems to have only ever been 4, Iridikron the Stone-Scaled, Farak the Blazing, Viranath the Frozen Heart, and Razageth the Storm Eater. I'm sure most of you remember them vividly as they served as the main antagonists of Dragonflight, but even if you can't, their epithets make it pretty easy to reason out who controls what. These 4 were shown to be relatively on par with the aspects, though Farak certainly seemed to eclipse them after gorging himself on Shadowflame. There doesn't seem to be a strict limit of 4, anyone strong enough to survive the ritual could become one, and it seems to be sheer coincidence that the 4 we do have all associated with different elements. Well, a Watsonian coincidence at least. Razageth and Farak were both slain during Dragonflight, and Viranath abandoned the cause and became an aspect, so Iridikron is essentially the only incarnate left, leaving the group defunct. Now I'm going to shift attention to the 6 cosmic forces and each of their pantheons of varying magnitudes. Let's start with the most explored force, Order. At what I would argue is the lowest of Order's pantheons, we have the Keepers. These are the 9 strongest Watchers that were empowered by the Titans, and worked to suppress the Black Empire back in the day. These 9 were Arcadis, empowered by Khaz'goroth, Freya, empowered by Eonar, Hodir and Thorim, both empowered by Golganeth, Tyr, empowered by Egramar, Loken and Mimiron, both empowered by Norgannon, and Odin and Ra, both empowered by Aman'Thul. When Sargeras seemingly slew the other Titans, Norgannon managed to disperse their spirits into the Keepers, and thus save them from total annihilation, though the Keepers were not aware of what had transpired. Eventually, Loken was corrupted by Yogg-Saron, which led to the Keepers being heavily splintered. We deal with Arcadis in Vanilla, disabling him. We slay Loken in Wrath and work with Hodir, Thorim, Freya, and Mimiron to defeat Yogg-Saron. In Mop, we defeat and free Ra beneath the Throne of Thunder. We work with Odin in Legion, with his Skyhold serving as the Warrior Class Hall. In BFA, we work with Ra, but he is unfortunately corrupted by N'Zoth and put down. In Dragonflight, we managed to restore Tyr to functionality after he'd died long ago fighting the Cathraxi. And Viranath puts Odin on ice, but presumably only temporarily. The Keepers are a somewhat interesting group, being clearly inspired most heavily by the Norse pantheon, with most of them named directly after their influences. Many, though not all of them, seem to have some degree of elemental design to them. I do think they're made somewhat less interesting by the fact that they're essentially stand-ins for the Titans themselves on Azeroth, and as such, they felt like a much bigger deal back in the day. Next, we have the Dragon aspects, whom some would argue are weaker than the Keepers as the Keepers empowered them. But it was actually the Pantheon empowering them through the Keepers. Plus, they had their own innate strength already. It really doesn't matter either way, but I do see them as higher up the ladder in power. That being said, the aspects did sort of bend themselves to Tyr's desire out of a fear of having their blessing revoked. At any rate, the aspects were pretty well known to the players, especially after Cataclysm and Dragonflight. We had the original 5 who proved themselves by defeating Galakrond alongside Tyr. There was their leader, the Dragon Queen Alexstrasza the Lifebinder and her Red Flight, who devoted themselves to safeguarding life on Azeroth. There was her sister Ysera the Dreamer and her Green Flight, who were dedicated to warding the Emerald Dream and nature. There was Neltharion the Earth Warder and his Black Flight, who watched over the Earth itself and fulfilled the most militaristic role. There was Malygos the Spellweaver and his Blue Flight, who administered to the magic of Azeroth. And there was Nosdormu the Timeless One and his Bronze Flight, who would safeguard the timeways and causality and all that, particularly the one true timeline that the Titans care most about. Alexstrasza and Ysera were both empowered by Eonar, Neltharion by Khaz'goroth, Malygos by Norgannon, and Nosdormu by Aman'Thul. There's a lot of history with them, but the highlights, of course, were Neltharion's betrayal of the others and his shift into being Deathwing. This devastated the flights, particularly the Blue Flight, which led to Malygos' madness. We would slay Malygos during the Nexus War in Wrath. His successor would be chosen in Cataclysm, and this mantle fell on Kalecgos. We also wind up killing Nosdormu's evil future self, Murozond, soon after. The 4 other aspects united to help slay Deathwing at the end of the expansion, and seemingly lost their aspecthood in the process, which didn't make a ton of sense, but whatever. In Legion, Ysera is unfortunately corrupted by Xavius, and we have to put her down. Though thankfully, we see her again in Ardenweald and Shadowlands. Come Dragonflight, we set about restoring the aspects' power and determining who the new aspects will be. For the Greens, this falls to Ysera's daughter, Merithra. The Black Dragons have a much more turbulent process of figuring this out, with Rathian and Sibelian both vying for the role before ultimately standing aside and choosing Abyssian to serve instead. Despite our efforts, their actual aspecthood doesn't return until Farak is slain, at which point Azeroth herself empowers the 5 of them, as well as Viranoth as a new 6th aspect, choosing to deem herself the Aspect of Storms, as both a reflection of her own abilities and to honor her fallen sister, Raszageth. Due to their sheer focus, I consider the aspects one of the better handled pantheons of WoW, though I wouldn't say all of its members are treated equally. Among the original 5, Malygos is clearly the most neglected. Nosdormu still doesn't feel super well fleshed out, and Merithra certainly needs some more shine before she hopes to become remotely popular. The highest pantheon within Order, though it's arguable if the aspects even fall into that category anymore, are the group that we actually canonically refer to as the Pantheon. These are, of course, the Titans. These are Aman'Thul the Highfather, whom we know has some sway over time. There is Eonar, who is strongly affiliated with life and nature. There is Norgannon, who has great control over arcane magic. There is Golganeth, who controls the storms and seas. There is Khaz'goroth, Forge Master and Great Craftsman. There was Sargeras, who served as the champion of the Pantheon before losing his way and starting the Burning Legion. There was Agromar, who served as Sargeras' closest associate and fulfilled many of the same warrior duties. There was an unnamed titan that had been corrupted by old gods that Sargeras slew, which caused the Great Schism between he and his brethren. There is some speculation that this void-corrupted titan was Telogris, and that his remnants are what formed Telogris Rift, but there's basically no hard evidence of this, and I don't subscribe to it myself. And then there are the youngest 3 known titans, or rather, World Souls, just because we can't be sure that World Souls always naturally become titans. There was the newly born Argus, who served as the final boss of Legion, and whom had been pumped full of death magic, so that upon his demise he would be sent to the Shadowlands and crash into the Arbiter. Then there is Koresh and Azeroth, 2 World Souls who have yet to be born. Koresh is in a very feeble state after Dementius devoured most of his world, but it's starting to heal. And Azeroth, well, there's both a ton to say about her and not much to say at all. Her awakening seems to be drawing near, and is why so many major events are happening in such a narrow time frame. And we know she seems to be able to influence those working near her, granting the Earthen free will in defiance of the Titans' edicts. Pretty much the only time we've interacted with the Titans directly has been at the end of Antorus, so despite their importance, they're still a very mysterious group. They seem to be somewhat of a mixture of actual Greek Titans and its Olympians, with a splash of Norse influence as well. At any rate, it's far less one-to-one than other similarly inspired groups. I don't have super strong feelings about the Pantheon as a whole, but I do really like the concept of them being the evolved forms of world souls, with the planets themselves serving as massive incubation chambers. That's a pretty awesome concept that we've probably become a bit too used to at this point, just since we've known it since at least Legion. Now let's rapidly move through the 3 cosmic forces whose pantheons we know the least about. Despite having dealt heavily with the Burning Legion, we never really saw a pantheon for Fel or Disorder. This would inherently make a lot of sense given that we're talking about literal disorder here, but still, it's a bit surprising. The closest candidates we have here are Sargeras, though he's merely a fallen titan, or Archimonde and Kil'jaeden, though they are merely Eridar empowered by Sargeras himself, formerly being on the same level as Velen. Then we have Light that we know even less about. The highest tier beings we know of are the Naru, but even the likes of Adal and Zira don't feel that major in the grand scheme of things, and we've seen a whole bunch of them at this point. It's been hypothesized by Velen that Elune may be tied to the Light, something which Tyrande rebuked. But who knows, Elune may be a member of the Light Pantheon. Alternatively, Elune may be a member of the Life Pantheon, as she is often associated with life, and her mysterious dalliance with Aenar implies that to be what she's affiliated with. Whether light or life, Elune is regarded by the Winter Queen as her sister, which is interesting to say the least. Still, outside of this, and arguably the Wild Gods, we've seen nothing in regards to the Pantheon of Life. Moving on to the Void, which we have slightly more insight on, I'd like to touch briefly on the Sha. The 7 Prime Sha were created with the dying gasp of the strongest old god, Y'Shaarj. These represented and exacerbated 7 negative emotions within those that were exposed to them: anger, despair, doubt, fear, hatred, pride, and violence. These were clearly inspired by the 7 deadly sins, and are kind of cool in concept, but I think the chosen sins, or emotions, were kind of dumb. I know they wanted to do their own thing, but doubt and despair are kind of similar. And anger, hatred, and violence all feel like minor variations of wrath. It doesn't feel like the most thought out detail, and some of the Sha were dealt with way too casually. Like, they aren't the biggest threats in Warcraft by any stretch of the imagination, but still. Anyway, as I said, they were the remnants of Y'Shaarj, who himself was one of 4 old gods infecting Azeroth. Despite this relatively small number, we know that there were like a bajillion old gods shot out of the void in an attempt to hit planets and corrupt any world souls they could find. So in a sense, the old gods are just glorified spores, but I think they work as a pantheon of sorts. The old gods don't seem to have specific things they each represent, which is honestly kind of a nice change of pace, though their different locales do give each of them a little bit of flavor. There was Y'Shaarj, who was slain in ancient times by Aman'Thul, and whose Sha remnants we handle in Mop. There was Cthulhu, who we faced off against in Ahn'Qiraj. There was Yogg-Saron, who we slew in Ulduar, and N'Zoth we took down in Ny'alotha. The first 3 each seem to command their own flavor of Akir forces as well. The Mantid for Y'Shaarj, the Nerubians for Yogg-Saron, and the Silithid for Cthulhu. There's far too much to say about them. I made a video talking about how heavily WoW utilizes the Void, but suffice to say, they're cool. We also had Gahun, an attempt by the Titans to create an artificial old god that they could study. I think Gahun is pretty cool, but he seems more officially to be regarded as a very dangerous wild god. Seemingly comprising the Pantheon of the Void, we have the Void Lords, though we ultimately know fairly little about them. The only one we know of for sure is Dimensius, who was temporarily dispersed by the Koreshi when they blew up their own planet, which he was going to devour anyway. We defeat a fragment of him in Netherstorm, and he is later reformed during Manaforge Omega, where we slay him again, though it could be argued that, like Argus, he was newly formed and not at full Void Lord power. I think Chronicles suggested that Invalidus from Draenor may have been a Void Lord, instead of the more of the run-of-the-mill Void Lord without a space, but there's been nothing else substantiating this either. Funnily, or perhaps sadly depending on how we look at it, Metzen basically confirmed that Dimensius was the last of the Void Lords, which feels pretty weird because he was basically the only one we ever dealt with. But with him as our only point of reference, The Void Lords just seem to be really big Void Walkers. I would have loved to see at least one more so we could have had a point of comparison, because otherwise it doesn't sound like there was a ton of variety to them. And lastly, that brings us to the Pantheons of Death, and it was in Shadowlands where we really leaned into the military ranking type lesser Pantheons that I mentioned at the top of the video. Each of the major covenants seem to have their own hierarchy that I'm going to touch on. The Kyrian of Bastion are organized into 5 temples, each with their own paragon, and each paragon has at least one hand to serve as their lieutenant. Purity's paragon is Visiphone, and her hand is Iridia. Humility's paragon is Chrysis, and his hand is Voitha. Courage's paragon is Xandria, and her 2 hands are Artemide and Apollon, though her previous hand was Thanikos before he was slain. Wisdom's paragon is Thenios, and his hand is Arios Riftbearer. Loyalty's paragon was Devos, and her hand was Lasonia. Both of them defected to the Forsworn and branded their virtue as doubt. During Shadowlands, Loyalty was ultimately replaced with the Devotion, with the Polemarch Adrestes stepping up to fill the role and Clea serving as his hand. The Necrolords of Maldraxxus are organized into 5 houses, each with their own Margrave, and each Margrave has 2 hands to serve as their lieutenants. The warrior-centric House of the Chosen was led by Margrave Crexus, whose 2 barons were Alexandros Mograine and Vyraz. Vyraz betrayed Crexus and caused his death, assuming the position of Margrave himself. Although in opposition to Vyraz and the bulk of the house until he was slain, Mograine and Draka both claimed the title of Baron, and eventually Draka was named as the Margrave of the house. The spellcasting and necromantic House of Rituals is led by Margraine Sindane, whose 2 barons were Kel'Thuzad and Ninadar. Both betray her and are eventually slain. Balmadar is chosen as one of her new barons, with the other spots still unoccupied. The abomination-focused House of Constructs was led by Margrave Garmal, whose 2 barons were Hallis and Antolite. All 3 fell, with none of their positions being filled from what we last saw. The espionage-focused House of Eyes was led by Akarak, who perishes during the Maldraxxus Afterlife short. His 2 baronesses were Vash and Draka. Draka's services were transferred to the House of the Chosen, leaving Vash as the only baroness and with the house still bereft of a Margrave. And the House of Plagues, which shockingly specialized in plagues, was led by Margrave Stradama, who was slain due to the House of Rituals machinations. It is unknown who her 2 barons were, though it seems extremely likely that Plague Deviser Marilith may have been one given his closeness to Stradama and his being far and away the most prominent member after its fall. But officially, to our knowledge, the house has no current barons, or Margrave. The Night Fae of Ardenweald don't have quite as rigid a structure, though each of Ardenweald's celestial trees had an associated Droman who seemed to lead operations in that region. Lady of the Falls served as Droman for the Glitterfall Basin. Alioth served as Droman of Tirna Glane. Dawn Blossom for Tirna Fen, Krelnor for Tirna Rowan, Ulfarin for Tirna Scythe, Tashmir for Tirna Val, and it's possible that Arelon had served as Droman of Tirna Nock. I guess that would make King Concobar the Droman of Tirna Noak. Anyway, Krelnor winds up being possessed by the Drust and put down. Other than that, I suppose you just have prominent members of the Court of Night, such as Lady Moonberry, Izera, and Lord Hearn. The Venthyr of Ravendreth again draw from the 7 deadly sins as a well of inspiration, as it is led by the Court of Harvesters. The general leader and the Harvester of Dominion is Prince Renathal. The Accuser was the Harvester of Pride, though she was briefly usurped by Lord Chamberlain before resuming her position. The Stonewright is the Harvester of Wrath. The Tithe Lord was the Harvester of Envy, but was slain, his position currently vacant. The Fearstalker was the Harvester of Dread, again defeated and her position is still vacant. The Curator is the Harvester of Avarice, and the Countess is the Harvester of Desire. Although similarly unexplored, I do overall prefer this set of sins over the Shah. It basically maps to the traditional 7 1-to-1, except for Gluttony and Sloth being replaced by Dread, basically Fear, and Dominion, which is kind of weird, but okay. Given their role as antagonists and something we never really get to see much of the inner workings of, the Mossworn don't have much of a pantheon within its ranks, though it did have notable members like Sylvanas, Kel'Thuzad, Helia, and Muzala. The Attendants of Oribos also don't have a super well explored hierarchy, though Tal Inara serves as the Arbiter's honored voice. And that then brings us to the actual highest tier death pantheon, the Eternal Ones. These were the 5 leaders of the major zones and covenants of the Shadowlands, seemingly there since the beginning and the progenitors of much of their native populations. We have Corestria, the Firstborn, also known as the Archon, who leads the Kyrian of Bastion. We have the Primus, who leads the Necrolords of Maldraxxus. There's the Winter Queen, who leads the Night Fae of Ardenweald. We have Sire Denathrius, who led the Venthyr of Revendreth, though he was deposed and sealed away, with Renathal and the Court of Harvesters leading in his wake. And there was Zoval, who served as the Arbiter, leading the attendants of Oribos before being deposed by the other Eternal Ones. He then served as the Jailer, leader of the Mawsworn and the Maw, before we eventually kill him. He was replaced with the construct known as the Arbiter to be more impartial, though this was eventually destroyed by him. The Arbiter position was later filled by Pelagos, when the soul that was meant to fill the replacement construct was destroyed. This continues to be wildly hilarious to me, but it's what we got. And that's everything we've got so far. Pretty much every Pantheon that exists in WoW. I wasn't lying when I said there were a lot. I don't think it's inherently bad to have more than one Pantheon, because we had a fairly loose definition of the word. You could certainly argue lots of stories have several Pantheons. But it has, admittedly, perhaps gone a bit out of hand in Warcraft's case. Still, I can't really put too much blame on the writers. It's hard to resist the temptation to make your own group of people who lead and represent things. It's almost human nature to want to do so. This video didn't really have much of a thesis. I just wanted to give a brief rundown of the many deity groups we've been presented with. Maybe when crafting your own Pantheon for your own story, you'll be able to look at what you enjoyed from WoW's different groups and what you didn't enjoy. My favorite is the old gods, but there are definitely things that have changed about them, such as giving them more character focus, maybe differentiating them a little bit more, and maybe have a few more. But I also do like bits and pieces of the other Pantheons I've covered. The Eternal ones weren't perfect, but they were pretty fun. The Aspects and the Incarnates are kind of cool too. Huh? What are you talking about? First ones? What the heck are those? Okay, fine. I'll talk about the first ones just a bit. We really know extremely little about them. Simply that they seem to be a pantheon that exists above even the 6 cosmic pantheons. They seem to have created the 6 cosmic forces, in fact. It's very possible that there were 6 of these progenitors, 1 for each force, and it's speculated by some in universe that there is a 7th. The architecture of Oribos, and obviously Zereth Mortis, as well as presumably the other Zereths, seems to have originated from them, and they seem to be tied to concepts such as mathematics, fractals, ciphers, and the like. Honestly, it's all very vague and malleable at this point. I believe the only mention of them that we've seen outside of Shadowlands has been an obscure book found in Uldaman, Legacy of Tyr, that features Odin basically saying they need to shut up about the first ones because they don't want mortals getting confused. Yep, definitely nothing to do with Titan propaganda trying to convince us that they're the highest beings on the food chain. Nope. Not that at all. So yeah, we'll see what comes of that. For this week's drawing, I had dozens, if not hundreds, of options I could have gone with, but opted for Alakir, the most underutilized, but my favorite of the Elemental Lords. I just think he has a cool name and an awesome design, and always thought he got kind of a bum deal basically being canonically known as the weakest of the 4. We don't know very much at all about his personality, simply that, like all Elemental Lords, he's very capricious in nature. And I'm overall pretty happy with how he turned out. I expected the wind effects within his body to be harder to do than they were, and I drew him where we fight him in the game at the Throne of the Four Winds, which wound up being a lot harder to do than I expected, which I mostly blame on the architecture sort of blending into the clouds. I feel like either on their own would have been okay, but trying to make that transition feel natural was exceedingly difficult. So if there's anything here I'm discontent with, it's the background. But that should be everything for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye!